Hello everyone. So hopefully you've seen the new video, the ramble. There's two things that have come out of that I just want to stress just very quickly before I go on to this review. But the first thing is that, again, it's that issue that I have, where I mention it most of the time when I'm doing a review, is that most reviewers on YouTube, I imagine, read in a sort of sequential or linear order, where they read a book and they just review it and it's all fresh in the mind. For me, it's really a case of trying to complete a backlog of books that I had previously read. It's just the way it is. I just wanted, I kind of want to tell people why they should read a certain book and choose my favourites and whatnot, as opposed to just read every single book and review every single book, if you see what I mean. And that, however, makes it quite difficult sometimes to get motivation to do a review, to record a video, because sometimes I've obviously read a book quite a while ago. For example, Frankenstein I read in 2017, so that was quite an effort to remember it, even though it's one of my favourite books. Same is true of this book, actually. I read it a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. I think I read it in October of last year. And again, that just makes it kind of difficult to get the motivation, so that's why I don't often do reviews. I don't often upload. Another aspect of that, another facet of that, is that sometimes I feel like I don't do the book justice. And that's unfortunate, because obviously, for me, when I'm revisiting these books, it's really just a case of, most of the time anyway, for the books that I've read a while ago, it's just a quick revisit on Wikipedia, and then maybe looking at a blurb that I wrote to a friend or whatever, and then just skipping through the pages and looking at the themes, and just a very sort of vague revisit of a book, so it doesn't quite do it justice sometimes. But then obviously other times I'll read a book, and in the very next day or even the same day I'll review it, and that'll be fine. But yeah, most of the time I'm sort of struggling to pick a book because I read that a while ago, and there are several books like that I need to review. I need to do justice, because they were good at the time. It's just I forget, and obviously the more time that elapses that I don't record a review, obviously the more difficult it gets to actually do the review. Anyway, this is Narcissus and Goldmund by Hermann Hesse, or Hesse, I believe it's Hesse, he's German. This book has an incredible cover, as you can see on the video. Obviously I'll just start off with the back, as I usually do. Two men become friends in a medieval monastery. Narcissus, dark and serious, and Goldmund, sunny, childlike and reckless. When Goldmund realises he is not meant for a life of self-denial, he sets off on the road in search of experience, becoming entangled in the extremes of a world dominated by sin, plague and war, until, many years later, he encounters Narcissus one final time. Bringing to life the Middle Ages in all their beauty and horror, Hesse's profound masterpiece of the imagination explores friendship, love, death, fate, and the true meaning of freedom. There's a lot in here, as you can just tell by that blurb at the back. And that encapsulates what I think of this book. To me, although this book is quite short, I believe it's about about 300 pages, standard book length. It feels like a life, really is. This, if you've seen the film Seventh Seal, it feels like that. Definitely feels like that. And actually the main character, Goldmund, he reminds me of the knight in Seventh Seal quite a lot, actually. What I can say about this is that it left quite an impression on me, and I do tend to react more and be more receptive to books that have concrete imagery, and this sort of dichotomous image on the cover of light and, or not light and dark, but nature and ethereality and heaven really stuck in my mind. And it's one of those books that covers themes that I really I'm receptive to. And this story is not so much plot based as it is an exploration of philosophy and art and the meaning of life. It really, not to sound too pretentious, but it really is. There's something about it. You just have to read it for yourself. It's about this this young boy called Goldmund who enters a monastery school in Germany, medieval Germany, and we're not quite sure what year it's set really, it's just vaguely medieval, who eventually meets this gifted student, this very analytical and introspective person called Narcissus. And I actually had trouble with that actually, in terms of the names. I imagined that Narcissus would be the Goldmund character, but it's actually the other way around, because obviously Narcissus, you imagine someone who is quite narcissistic and vain and proud, but it's actually not the case really. Anyway, so once Goldmund meets Narcissus, really a friendship sort of develops and springs from that first encounter. And the two are diametrically opposed. This whole book is about the Apollonian and Dionysian extremes, I suppose. So on the one hand, the Apollonian is a very analytical and masculine and high-minded. There's a list. There's actually, I'm sure I could look at a list and figure out the different, just rattle off the list of characters and qualities, but I'm just trying to do it from memory. And the Dionysian, of course, is the more rustic, nature-based, sort of extracting from life, everything from life that can be extracted, I suppose. So obviously Narcissus is the scholarly, spiritual person, and Goldmund is the humanistic side of things. That's really how I can encapsulate that, and I love that. It may be a bit simplistic, however, I found that the treatment of these two characters is actually very well rounded. There's something about this where it's really just an examination of two lives. It's principally, though, however, about Goldmund. He finds he's sort of strafing at custom's chain, if I can use I can't remember what the word is, but it's from Call of the Wild. A saying, I suppose, from Call of the Wild. He always wants to get out and experience life and the sort of the worldly aspects of existence. And eventually, it's not really a spoiler to say, eventually he leaves the monastery and he has lovers and he gets into fights and he experiences pain and suffering, but also the joy and ecstasy of life. So obviously you can just if you're looking at the cover of this, you can see that on the right hand side, that is the Goldmund aspect of fruit and nature and taking from life what can be extracted. And all the negatives and positives of that. And obviously Narcissus, he is very much devoted. He's a very skillful and talented and subtle character. He this dark figure, this religious figure who is very ascetic and devoted to God and study of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and whatnot. And I should say, I chose this. I decided to finally review this because not only is it one of my favourite books, I'm also reading obviously that book. If you've seen the other video, I'm reading that book on very similar topics and very similar themes and aesthetics and whatnot. Anyway, so Goldmund is out in the world doing his thing, and then Narcissus is with the brothers in his monastery, trying to attain spiritual sort of purity. And really, I can really just encapsulate this by saying it's like Seventh Seal in that there's this figure of Goldmund going out. He's a wanderer. He's a Dionysian wanderer, experiencing life. And there's actually some brutal elements to this. He actually encounters the Black Death. There's plague. There's war. There's famine. All the typical medieval parts of the medieval sort of experience that you might imagine. But there's this element that I'll get into now, where Goldmund. So the book. I'm trying to figure out a way to say this. The Goldmund changes over time, as does Narcissus. It's the whole book. I love the structure of it because it's so neat. It might be simplistic, but it's very neatly structured. Goldmund changes and Narcissus changes, and the two complement each other quite often. And it's really about the sort of dichotomous structure. So Goldmund changes from this character who is very much in love with life to wanting to be more spiritual in a sense, and the way he does that, the way he fulfills that, is he becomes an artist. He is someone who works with his hands. He's very practical, and there's something that I always remember from this book. He goes to, after all this after all these adventures, he finds himself staring at a statue of, I can't remember, I think it's a Madonna, carved Madonna, and he finds such beauty in it, such awe, that it shakes him to his core. And I really remember that. I revisit it quite often, and that sort of is the impetus for him to actually go and seek out a master craftsman, and he becomes a student of the master. And a whole phase of this book is his trying to attain sheer sort of mastery in art. In art. That's an aspect of the book I really enjoyed. And this is a really slow book. It's a very, very thoughtful and reflective book. And of course, on the other side of that, Narcissus, we don't actually get to see as much of Narcissus as I'd like to have. When I was first reading this, I remember thinking that I thought this book was supposed to be maybe a 50-50 split between the two, but it's really more about Goldmund. And I don't want to say much more than that, because it's not really a plot-based book. It's more to do with Goldmund's trajectory and Narcissus' trajectory as well. And really, whole sections of this book really just devolve into... It's just dialogue most of the time, to be honest, and I found it quite enjoyable though. It's they're talking about art and life and philosophy and different ways of viewing the world and questioning each other. And there's something quite relaxing about it as well. It's this sort of, maybe it's obviously idealistic, but there's something about Narcissus, just to go back to Narcissus, about his studies in the monastery, and he I think there's one point where he practices herbalism with Father Anselm, and it's just very, I found it very pleasing to read. We have this gradual change of characters, and there's really quite a poignant moment near the end where actually, it actually does say at the back of the book, I just remembered, so I can say this at least. The characters meet again. There's a very poignant moment where Narcissus is fundamentally changed, and so is Goldmund in particular, since he's obviously the protagonist. And the ending, this actually gave me goosebumps, because it's really about loss. It's about losing someone that's so dear to you that you're sort of changed as well. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It's something to read. This book is very much about lives, two lives, about interchanging paths. It's about dichotomy. It's about different philosophies and ways of looking at the world, the analytic compared to the artistic, etc., etc. So I'll just read this fairly long excerpt here, just to give an overview of what this book feels like and what it reads like, and just the sort of interdependence of Narcissus with Goldmund and vice versa. It's really, and it also encapsulates the sort of the feeling of time and movement and sort of the need for the one and the other, I suppose. Each day at some hour, the abbot's, that's Narcissus, the abbot's thoughts would return to his friend, in love and longing, in gratitude and anxiety, sometimes also with misgivings and self-reproach. Should he not have perhaps revealed to his friend more of how much he loved him, how little he wished to be other than he was, how enriched he had been by him and by his art? He had told him very little about this, much too little perhaps. Who knows whether he might not have been able to hold on to him. But he had not only become richer through Goldmund, he had become poorer and weaker, and it was no doubt just as well he had not shown this to his friend. The world in which he lived and had his home, his world, his monastic life, his office, his scholarship, his nicely organised thought structure, had often been violently shaken and cast into doubt by his friend. Without question, From the point of view of the monastery of reason and morality, his own life was better, more correct, stable, more orderly and exemplary. It was a life of order and strict service, a perpetual sacrifice, a constantly renewed striving for clarity and justice, very much purer and better than the life of an artist, vagabond and rake. But seen from above, through the eyes of God, was the order and discipline of an exemplary life, the renouncing of the world's sensual pleasures, the distancing from dirt and blood, the withdrawal from, into philosophy and meditation, better than Goldmund's life? Had man really been created to lead a regulated life whose hours and functions were announced by prayer bells? Had man really been created to study Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, to master Greek, to repress his senses and flee the world? Had he not been created by God with senses and urges, with pits of blood-stained darkness, with the capacity for sin, lust, and despair? It was around these questions that the abbot's thoughts revolved when he dwelled on his friend. Yes, and perhaps it was not only more childlike and human to lead the life of a Goldmund, it might be greater too, more courageous to abandon oneself to those cruel currents and confusions, to commit sins and accept their bitter consequences, instead of washing one's hands and leading a spotless life set apart from the world. Instead of planting a beautiful, harmonious intellectual garden and promenading without sin among its carefully tended beds. Perhaps it was harder, braver and nobler to roam the forests and highways with ragged shoes, exposed to sun and rain, hunger and privation, playing with the pleasures of the senses and paying for them with suffering. However that might be, Goldmund had shown him that a person destined for higher things can plunge deeply into the blood and drunken chaos of life, and cover himself with much dust and blood, without becoming petty and mean, without killing the divine spark within him, that he can go astray among the dark depths without the divine light and the creative force in the sanctuary of his soul being extinguished. Narcissus had looked deeply into his friend's life, and neither his love nor his respect for him had been diminished. I'll leave it there for now. That's a passage where I feel that it's quite unfortunate that some people, how to put it, are sort of content to read books without much to say, sort of books that are purely entertainment and only have one dimension to them. That was Narcissus and Goldmund. I'm glad I finally reviewed that. Actually, it's a brilliant book. Yeah, I do definitely recommend it. Actually, it's I remember from last year. It was definitely probably in the top 3 books I read. So yeah, highly recommend. Thanks for watching, everyone. Cheers.